going on, everybody? Welcome back to Off the Top Podcast. This is Julian. Jordan, how are you doing today?
Man, I'm great. Super happy. It's, the weekend. I'm podcasting. You can't get better. How about yourself?
Doing pretty good. Random question for you. When essentially you're cooking, do you have any special recipes or spices that you do with anything?
Yeah, man. I have Uncle Jay's chicken that, has pineapple in it. I'm a big chili pepper guy. I garlic powder, all the good stuff. I'm a spice guy for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting the amount of spices that there are today and, how relatively inexpensive they are in today's society, where I can go to my local grocery store and pick up whatever spice I need for $4, $3, depending on, the quality, if it's a Whole Foods or if it's a dollar store, which I don't know if the dollar store has spices, but they might. But essentially, why I say this today is we're going to be talking about the Dutch East India Company. And if you aren't familiar with who they are or what they were, it's a very fascinating story.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I, preface this as in, I wanted to talk about the world's biggest company. And so, a lot of people naturally would think, as far as market cap, Apple, or, as far as revenue, maybe Walmart or something like that. But when I'm talking about all time, the GOAT of big companies, we're dealing with the Dutch East India Company.
And another name for the Dutch East India Company is going to be something I'm going to butcher, and we're going to refer to as the VOC. But essentially, the VOC stands for the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, which is Dutch or from, the Netherlands.
Absolutely. And first off, I just want to make a shout out to Julian for being brave enough to put himself out there with that pronunciation. And just to give this company a little bit more color for you listeners, it was around the 16th and 17th century and was created in the Netherlands.
Yeah. So March 20th, 1602 is when they were founded by the United Provinces, and they kind of ceased on December 31st of 1799. And during this reign, they were in what some people kind of call the golden era for, trading and the Dutch Empire.
Yeah, exactly. And so I would love to, jump in on, how they were created a little bit. So basically, if you don't know, I learned pretty recently, the Netherlands is comprised of multiple states, and one including, Holland as I guess two main states. And so what happened with the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, was that you had a conglomerate of basically representatives of each state that, united their power to create one entity, almost like the Power Rangers, which is, I know the most childish representation of it, but that's what I thought about when I first listened to them. And then they created this company that had superpowers. They could do incredible things as far as make treaties, wage war, mint coins. It's insane what the power that they gave them. And it started off on basically $100 million investment that just funded a whole bunch of projects for them.
Essentially, I'm not going to lie, when Jordan first pitched this topic to me, I was a little bit skeptic on the fact that I was like, okay, this company was around in the 1600s, the 1700s. Everything is going to be very different when you look at companies today and the competition in the market. And, being first in market for them was probably, there wasn't any competition, or there wasn't any, they were the first of their kind. That's why they were valued so big. And, there's this one dude who really understood what was going on. But the thing about the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company, is essentially that they were a giant monopoly, like a huge monopoly that was created when, the United Provinces was worried about England starting to dominate the trade. So they combined a ton of different small provinces and leaders and just ran things for a while.
That is the perfect point to display for our listeners, because how they became a monopoly is that they started beating up other countries, which sounds insane. Like, just imagine if Apple started going over to, like, India, and started just like cleaning house and like taking resources from India, and started like putting Apple factories in India, and just being like, well, what are you going to do about it, India? Huh? And like just plunk them. It's just insane. Like, so the Dutch East India Company and their sister company, I think the Dutch West India Company, waged war on like countries like, uh they waged war on the British, the Portuguese, and Portuguese settlements in, like, Chile, Brazil, West Africa, India, Southeast Asia. It's insane. Like, these guys were not any sort of company that you can visualize or conceptualize that you've ever seen before. It's like, mind-boggling learning about this thing.
You painted the exact same picture that I painted. I didn't use Apple. I like to think of Walmart because they're one of the larger companies in today's society. But imagine all of Walmart's employees, from the store greeter to the janitor to the cashier and the clerks. Imagine them going to other countries as employees and soldiers for Walmart, and Walmart not being a business, but being an armed force, a country, essentially a state, and ravaging other places to further ensue their monopolistic ideas and capitalize on some of these contracts they made people sign. And it's just unbelievable that, that's how business was at that point. And you can see why they adjusted for today were valued at $7.9 trillion.
It's extraordinarily cavalier that companies and people could take the actions that they did back then. And it's almost hard to believe that, oh, it's everybody doing this. And you would imagine that the VOC themselves were just this crazy. But just to take a step backwards on how they became, started, smacking other countries, which is basically what they were doing. The VOC started with basically the spice imports, like Julian, so well eloquated when we first started. So what they would do is go to places, like Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, or, the place where the Bandinese people come from, and, trade for their spices. And a lot of the times when they were trading for spices, there would be, like ports. So there would be a British port, there'd be a Portuguese port, there'd be a Spanish port. And so eventually, basically, the stable diet of the VOC at first was just, all right, so I'm just going to buy the spice, bring it back over to the Netherlands, sell it. But eventually, when they got big enough, the costs dropped for that. And, it just got more competitive because everyone was doing it. And that's when they started, kind of like coercing countries and, taking charge, shutting down other countries as well as a company.
Yeah. And you may be asking the same question or the same questions. Where are Bandinese people from? I'm not really sure. Listeners, you may know, and you can shoot us an email. And you also might be asking, why spices? Why was spices, the first thing that the VOC went after? And it's all due to our boy Jan. I'm going to butcher this name. I'm sorry once again. Jan Huygen van Luskronten. Yeah, but
sorry, I shouldn't be laughing.
Boy Jan wrote a document called the Itinerario, and in this document he laid out the prevalence of spices in these different areas and the value that it could bring. As at this point, we're so used to spices today, it's in your kitchen right now, that or at your grocery store, that's so easily accessible. But back then, he went and found all these different places and these different, from pepper to Chile or something along those lines. And it's like, okay, here's some value here. And if we, you trade this, you own this, and you distribute this through your town, there's some potential value here. And so after, the United Provinces formed the VOC, this was one of the first reasons that they went after spices.
Conceptually, it makes perfect sense. If you imagine living the way you live, just without having any sort of spice. And so that means spice that, comes in your food as well. So if you have chocolate milk, that, you don't have chocolate milk, you have milk. Or, you don't even have salt or pepper and things like that. So you can imagine how spices became almost worth their weight in gold, if you can imagine that. And so that's why the VOC started doing those things. And one of the things, I just want to touch on that bandonese thing. So basically what the VOC did with the bandonese is probably one of the more crazier things I've ever heard of.
Got nutmegged.
No, seriously. So the reason that Bandonese is a place where you get nutmeg, and they used to sell to everybody. As far as the British had a port there. I think the Spanish had a port there, and obviously the VOC was going back and forth to get nutmeg. Eventually, the VOC got pretty aggressive. They had the Bandonese sign this contract. Secretly, the contract was basically like to a ruse so that the Bandonese had no choice but to violate the terms of the contract. The second that they violated the terms of the contract, the VOC basically took them over and then shut the whole thing down and said, you get nutmeg from us now. Nobody else can get nutmeg from anybody else. And so they locked down the whole nutmeg game, which I've never thought was going to be, if you ever think damn, man, VOC got us again, that there's your example.
I really hope, I picture, this Bandonese civilian, this happening, and the first thing him saying is, nuts. Well, perfect way to do it. And yeah, essentially, the what really tipped it off too is they weren't getting food into the Bandonese civilians weren't, and that was part of the contract. They couldn't trade outward to other countries, and that's how they got food. And so the Bandonese retaliated and killed 47 VOC employees. I don't know what you want to call them. They were a company, but they were soldiers and everything else. But they killed 47 of them, and then the VOC said, you got nutmegged, and just kind of pillaged the village at that point.
Exactly. And so what they started doing in places like the Bandonese, or places where the Bandonese people come from, or other places, is that they'd start doing crazy things like ethnic cleansing and, populating islands with slaves. And what would happen then is basically their thought was, instead of trading with these people, we'll just bring in our own slaves, have them work, harvest these fruit or, spices, and then we'll just ship them out because they think the costs would be lower. So what they have here is that a company is doing ethnic cleansing and populating islands with slaves for the bottom dollar. Could you imagine, a company in their company call, which another really interesting fact is that the VOC was the first company ever to offer equity and debt publicly. So they were the first company to be traded on a stock exchange. So could you imagine on their company call, their annual call? Yeah, so we're doing really good. We just took out all the Bandonese people. So, if your grandma was in Bandonese, don't worry about calling her on her birthday. She's not going to pick up. And you were making great profit here. It's just I don't know. We're so far removed from this that it was hard doing research on this stuff because I was like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, it's very interesting that they were a publicly owned company with a military. And, the things and what people get mad about today for publicly owned companies, from Elon Musk's tweet, and little things like that. So, this state, this country, this, conglomerate, whatever you want to call them, they were doing everything, and it was just kind of, no one could stop them. And it's interesting to me that they were going this route of ethnic cleansings and essentially trapping and duping these other countries to use their resources, that they really found their wealth in tulips.
Yeah, very, very good point. So if you guys are familiar with something that's called tulip mania, then that basically at some point in Europe, tulips became the thing. You can imagine a dot-com bubble, but the dot-com bubble wouldn't even get close to what tulip mania was. Basically the sale of these tulips that only blossomed for just about like a couple weeks, and it took 7 months to grow, which is just insane. They started making insane money on them. So for instance, somebody who would like, sell tulips for like a day job would make $62,000, like today's dollars, a month.
It's funny too, because when we think of tulips like inexpensive, grow it on your own, but back then it wasn't a thing. So for perspective, besides what they were, a trader was making, this is what an alleged gift basket for one Viceroy tulip was at this point in time. So it was 2 lasts of wheat, 4 lasts of rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 fat swine, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, 4 turns of beer, 2 tons of butter, TUNS of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a complete bed. Someone gave their whole bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver drinking cup, which equivalents to like 2,500 florins, which was, their currency at the time, for one tulip.
I'm just going to give another second just so that sinks in for you guys. It is insane. It's crazy what they are doing for these, tulips. And there's a lot of things we could talk about here. But the thing that I want to talk about to get back to the VOC and all of this stuff is, as you can tell, the character of the VOC is, we're going to get in on this thing. It doesn't matter how or what. It doesn't matter who we have to punk. We're going to make some money in this. So they started selling futures, or set up a futures market for tulips. So in the fact that if you don't know what a futures market is, or derivatives in finance, basically what they did was they made a platform where I could go out and be like, hey, so I want to buy a tulip in about 8 months time when they, start fruiting, or, start the seeds coming out, but I want to buy it at this amount of money. So I'll pay somebody to lock in that agreement for me. So these guys are ahead of the curve when it comes to that stuff. And they made a grip of money in the futures markets with tulips and selling them themselves.
And as many negatives as, I wouldn't say negatives, but as many shady things that we've mentioned, the one thing I found really cool was that through this expansion, this monopoly, that they kind of geographically shaped the world as it is today. They found, various routes. They kind of helped these different regions get spices or trades, were exploring different places. They might not have been exploring for the right reasons, but they were finding these islands, like the Banda Islands, where the Bandanese are from, and all these other little areas to, find their best deals, or the tulips, or whatever they're looking for at that point in time. And that's where they play one of the areas they played a huge role into kind of expansion after their downfall.
There are, a few companies that I feel like affect the world in a way that'll never be the same. And I think this company is one of them. Just to paint the picture on what Julian's talking about the things of exploratory and finding new things and stuff like that, not the negative side of ethnic cleansing, which obviously would affect the world as well. But these people, explored and charted places and discovered things that we today, or back then when they even collapsed, was obviously a huge benefit once everything, once the territories that the VOC controlled got absorbed into the Netherlands, the country of the Netherlands themselves. You can imagine what the ramifications was for that. And the fact of this company, they employed 70,000 people at their peak or so. And I'm not sure if that's including slaves or not. So it could be higher. But what that equated to is 0.1% of the population. 0.1% of the population. That is a huge amount.
Yeah, some people, it might be hard to understand. Like 0.1 doesn't sound like a whole lot, but 0.1% of the entire world you employ, or you own, or whatever you're doing with them, is phenomenal, let alone having 70,000 employees. Like companies, there are very few companies today that have 70,000 employees. So to do that landmark in, from 1602 to 1799 is still a tremendous feat of how the VOC set up. And you can see how this monopoly affected others from getting in on the business and made them so profitable until essentially the investors got cold feet.
Yeah, exactly. And just for data fidelity, when I said point 0.1, I meant to say 0.01, which is still a huge number, but not, a tenth of the percent of the population. And to get back to what Julian left off at is somewhat of their demise when the investors got cold feet. Basically, what happened in that instance was the monopoly, I can imagine, got too big too big to control, and the costs and the expenses got too much to be supported by their trade, which obviously the more they traded, the less expensive the spices were going to be, and eventually that started a toppling effect of people getting cold feet, just like in Tulip Mania, and they had to basically shut down because of how huge they were, and they couldn't support the massive body that the VOC created for itself.
And you can say the VOC's monopoly fell on Hotel Row, didn't have enough money, and they were done. And I find it funny too that the Dutch, after this kind of established rules, so it wouldn't happen again. So like these giant conglomerates wouldn't happen, so that these giant the Tulip Mania, the first financial bubble, where financial bubbles didn't occur again in that era. And it's interesting in their retrospect, they're like, I guess I could see where that goes wrong, so we'll put these rules in place on where we really dominated, so no one else can do that to us.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's probably the way that you should do it, in the fact of learn from what happens from the past, and the fact of the VOC is this powerful, almost like something that you would never imagine happening, monster in a way. So, you learn from that, and you don't want that to happen again. So you make rules, and you make like basically antitrust rules to make sure there's no monopolies that are that crazy. And, I'm sure the British and the Spanish and stuff beefed up their military so they wouldn't get disrespected by a company ever again. And you go from there as a learning lesson.
The thing I'm thinking about too, and is time is relative. Jordan and I've talked about it, but this was only, 220 years ago, essentially. So it is relatively recent that giant companies were, roaming around doing their thing. And I mean, there's no companies today, but when you look back on the Dutch East India Company, and their valuation of $7.9 trillion, that is if you took Apple, Microsoft, and Google, combine them together, the Dutch East Company is going to be valued at 3 times more than those companies combined.
It's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine how massive this company was. We know how ubiquitous Apple, Microsoft, and Google are, in the fact of you can find them anywhere. All right, you turn around and you'll find something that's about Google, Apple, or Microsoft. So could you imagine something that was 3 times bigger than those things combined? It's hard to conceptualize.
The last thing I kind of want to touch on is, do you think though that it's unfair to essentially compare these companies to the VOC? Because if Apple, or say Microsoft, or Google, one of those three had the ability to be a monopoly in that space. So Microsoft or Apple controlled all, tech in this area, or Apple controlled all smartphones, all music, all tablets, all computers, etc., that it would be close to comparable? Or do you think for the time being that it would be a tough feat in today's society, even if you had a monopoly, to be valued at the same retrospect or the same as the VOC.
So I believe that the VOC is a particular instance of what happens when you see something that's very strange and not normal. But I want to take the opposite route of what you just said. I think that if the VOC, was in place and could be the VOC itself, like today, I feel like it would be pretty tough, not impossible, but I would say it would be pretty tough to be the VOC at this point in time in 2018. But I think that the VOC themselves, if they had the technology that Google, Apple, and Microsoft have, I couldn't imagine what they would have done. I couldn't imagine, the magnitude of their actions would be, I would say, tenfold. Imagine if this company, instead of cannons in, warships, had ballistic missiles or, like computer viruses to shut down places. I think that they would be even more massive if they had the tools that the companies today had. But they would have to be the VOC first. They couldn't start as like a small company. They would have to start as the big dog themselves. And then with those tools, holy cow, I'm getting shivers out here. But
yeah, simply with that, you guys can, hear through your little ears out there that there's obviously a lot that changes, but regardless, the VOC was a bad mamma jamma for a long period of time. And, they did a lot of negative things. They did a lot of positive things. And essentially, I think, without the VOC happening, our society might not be where it's at today. Some locations may have taken longer to have been discovered. Maybe some of these spices or foods would have been implemented later. It probably led to different versions of technology and that, laps and laps on top of each other. There's a lot of things that go into a company of this size that has effects on society. So it's always fun to listen and understand, what made these changes or what some of these companies look like or what a real monopoly could be in, that time period and compare it to today's society.
Exactly. I agree 100% with everything you said. And as basically a goodbye to you guys, first off, I want to admit this to you, Julian, and everybody else out there. I think I had more fun with this podcast than I thought I was going to have, as far as, looking up a company from the 16th and 17th century. That sounds like a blast, I know. But it's so cool to talk about something that's so interesting. It's so aberrant, so out of the ordinary. And with that being said, I hope you guys are, enjoying this. I'm enjoying this more and more, as you could tell by, talking about the VOC. And, we're on all the platforms, and we also are possibly looking for sponsor endorsements. I mentioned that last episode, or, a couple episodes ago. I'm sure it'll come out and you'll hear it if you listen to the ends of episodes. But also, if you guys are somebody who are interesting or important or cool and, appreciate what we're doing, you could reach out to us. And we'd love that on the off the top podcast at gmail.com. And also, possibly, if you think you can hang with us, maybe we can get you on the podcast sometime. Just let us know what you're about. And if we find you interesting, maybe you could set something up. I don't know.
Exactly. And I guess my parting words were think smart, don't get nutmegged. Thanks for listening, guys.